this morning. What we're going to do first off is just kind of look at the background of Marac development in Scotland. We've got an address from Christina McKelvie, the Equalities Minister for the Scottish Government after that, or after we've heard from our Authentic Voice Panel member as well as an input from the Vice President of COSLA, Councillor Stephen Heddle. And then we've got three inputs from guest speakers this morning, which we're very excited about. So we're hearing from Mhairi McGowan and Lily Greenan first off about the setup of the first Maracs in Scotland in 2005. Then Jess Denniff from Fife Marac is going to talk to us a little bit about their operational and strategic oversight. And then we're also going to be hearing from our newest Maracs in Ayrshire with Dale Meller and Amanda McHarg. At the end, we'll have some space for reflections and Q&A with the speakers, and also do some thinking about what the next steps for Marac in Scotland might look like. And Suzanne Jacob, the CEO of SafeLives, is going to do some closing remarks for us at the very end. You can go to the next slide, please, Steph. For those who are perhaps less familiar with Marac and the multi-agency landscape in Scotland than some of us are, we've just put together a brief glossary because we're aware that there might be some jargon that will be used during throughout the course of this event, and I'm sure we can get that posted in the chat as well. But just to be aware that these are terms that you might be hearing throughout this morning. In particular, Marac and IDA and DASH might be coming up, and I suspect some of the other acronyms there as well. So just to give you a wee heads up that this is what we're talking about when you're hearing some of those terms. And if we can go to the next slide, please, Steph. So again, for those less familiar with Marac, then perhaps myself and some of my colleagues in SafeLives are, a Marac, or a multi-agency risk assessment conference, is a local multi-agency meeting where agency representatives from both local statutory and non-statutory services come together to share information and create a joint action plan for victims of domestic abuse who have been assessed as being at high risk of harm. At the heart of Marac is really this assumption that no single agency or individual can see the complete picture of the life of a victim, but that all may have insights that are crucial to their safety. So in a way that we all have bits of the puzzle that can help us see the whole picture for families who are living with domestic abuse, and that we all have an opportunity to kind of support and make sure that they are safe. And that victims who are identified to be at high risk of serious harm deserve a coordinated response to the risk that they're living with. So this is what we're going to be hearing a lot more about this morning, and in particular thinking about what that means for Scotland and what that development of the Marac and the risk-led response has looked like in Scotland. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So we're really here this morning to mark and to celebrate the fact that we now do have 35 different Maracs operating across our 32 local authorities. So that means that a victim who has been identified as being at high risk of harm will be able to access a coordinated response to risk, no matter where they are in Scotland, which is a huge milestone. In particular, when we think about the fact that the first Maracs were set up over 15 years ago in 2005, so 17 years ago, I think almost to the day for some of them. It's taken us a long time to get to this point, and it deserves, everybody who's been involved in getting us to that point deserves a huge round of applause, I think, and big credit to them as well. We do have over 15 years of experience operating Marac in Scotland, and there's huge pockets of really, really good practice, but it's not been an easy road always to get to that point. The rollout in Scotland has been sort of largely organic, I think is fair to say, and has been driven by individuals in local areas who have taken it upon themselves to embed local systems that were responsive to risk, and who could see kind of the benefit of Marac within that. Marac was mentioned in Equally Safe in 2014, and we've had a Marac Development Programme funded by Scottish Government and delivered by SafeLives, and initially in partnership with Assist in Glasgow since 2015. And that was initially funded to create a sort of baseline report of how and where Maracs were operating across Scotland, but we've continued to support Marac development for the past 7-8 years, and looking at how we can embed the evaluated Marac model across local authorities to ensure that victims who are at high risk get that coordinated response to risk. Securing strategic buy-in and funding, resourcing for Marac, including for IDAs, Marac coordinators and chair has been a challenge in some areas, which means that sometimes that rollout has been slow and it has led to some discrepancies, I think is fair to say, in how the model has been applied or what that development has looked like. But the fact that we now do have full coverage across the country, I think, is something that is worth celebrating. I think we need to also acknowledge that the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 and onwards did kind of create a big shift in terms of what that Marac operation looked like. But the fact that all Maracs that were operational pre-pandemic continue to operate throughout both national lockdowns, and we even had one Marac starting up in the midst of the first national lockdown, I think is something that just reflects the commitment to the Marac model across Scotland and the need and the benefits of that model as well in terms of creating that coordinated response to risk for victims. And then lastly, just to mention as well, the Scottish Government consultation on multi-agency risk assessment arrangements, which was open in 2018-2019 and included some questions around what the future of Marac development would look like or should look like in Scotland, and the kind of work that's come out of that consultation, including the National Marac Advisory Group, and we are now expecting some recommendations from that and an action plan, and hopefully in the new year. And I'm sure the Minister will say more about that later on. If we can go to the next slide, Steph, we've put together a wee timeline of what this kind of Marac development has looked like across Scotland since 2005, just to kind of illustrate how gradual and kind of organic that rollout has been. So we started with 2 Maracs in 2005, and a couple of years later, we had a few more areas who were coming on board, some pilot rollouts in some areas. And really, I think from 2013, 14, perhaps coinciding with the creation of Police Scotland, we had a lot of areas that kind of came live or came on board in terms of that Marac model as well. But it's not really been, I think, what this kind of animation illustrates is that it's not been sort of a smooth rollout, if you like, and there's been ups and downs, and we can see there some areas that were suspended for a while as well because of lack of funding and resourcing for various aspects of the model. And then as of August this year, we now do have a fully pink map with Marac operating across all of Scotland's 32 local authorities, which is really heartening to see. If we can move on, Steph, what we wanted to just recognise as well and just talk briefly about is the importance of involving survivors and listening to the experiences of survivors who have gone through the Marac process themselves. So through Safer Sooner, which is our multi-agency programme, which builds on the work of the Marac Development Programme as well, we have been working with the Authentic Voice Panel since the start of this year. So the SafeLives Authentic Voice Panel is made up of 10 survivors from across Scotland who have diverse experiences of domestic abuse and who come from all across Scotland as well, and who provide a bit of oversight to most of our work in Scotland, and we work closely with them to make sure that our work is anchored in lived experience and has that survivor voice at the heart of it. And so from the start of this year, we've been working with the panel to understand what it feels like as a survivor to go through Marac or other multi-agency processes, and that's included various different activities from the start of our funding application to the Delivering Equally Safe Fund. We worked with the Authentic Voice Panel to understand what the priorities for survivors in terms of Marac development and ongoing multi-agency work were, and how we could better embed that lived experience throughout those processes and systems. We've reviewed some of the work, some of the existing resources that we have for Maracs with survivors, and looked at their views in terms of what the priorities are and how we can better embed their experiences and their voices in that. We've been working with them on the development of an animation which kind of highlights the journey through Marac, if you like, from the perspective of survivors. And we were really pleased at the start of last month to have a member of the Authentic Voice Panel represented on the Scottish Government Marac Advisory Group, speaking directly to the recommendations and informing kind of priorities for Marac development across Scotland going forward. If we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. These are some of the reflections from the AV panel members themselves that have come out through the work that we've been doing with them in their own words, and I think really puts words on why we need a whole picture response, why that's so important, why it's so important to involve survivors from the start and throughout the whole process, and to listen to what their priorities are. I think the quotes illustrate what a multi-agency process can feel like to survivors, and why we have to strive to ensure that they have an opportunity to be involved at each stage of that process, to inform the responses that are meant to keep them safe, and to have their safety and their best interests at their heart. And I think some of these quotes are quite telling in terms of what that feels like sometimes when we've got processes that are meant to keep survivors safe, and that are meant to be happening with them, but sometimes I suppose feel like they're happening to them, and where they kind of feel or can feel a little bit out of their control. I think what Helen has so brilliantly just put words on is the potential life-saving impact the Maracs can have when they work, and the importance to get it right, because it is people's lives that we are talking about here, and the quality and their safety. I'm going to hand you over here to Christina McKelvie, who is Minister for Equalities and Older People at the Scottish Government, and who is going to address this event next.
Thanks very much, Jenny, and thank you everyone for being here this morning. And can I say a special thank you to Helen, although she could only come to us via pre-record. I'm sure her words have touched us all, and her experience of Marac and how it supported her and her family. I think I tend to always hold the real people that I meet through these events and initiatives in my head when I'm making decisions. So Helen will join that group of folk that I will think about when we move forward with this work. But I'm really delighted to be with you this morning, and to say thank you to SafeLives for inviting me to speak to you during these 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. There's been a lot of events over the last 16 days, but in my opinion, the 16 days is a highlight. The next 365 days is where we have to keep doing the work, and that goes for me too. As we know, the theme this year is Unite, and I'm happy to be uniting my voice at this event with those of the other speakers, experts through experience and professional practice. I think we are here today as we recognise that domestic abuse has a devastating impact on victim survivors and is still a blight on Scottish society. It has no place in our vision for a safe, strong, successful Scotland, and is quite simply unacceptable in modern day Scotland. But more importantly, we are here today because we want to address the issue, identifying how we can collectively tackle it. We know that we need to ensure perpetrators are held to account, and that women and children have access to frontline services which understand the dynamics of domestic abuse. It's essential that those services work together effectively to provide a coordinated response to both risk and recovery. Marac is an important tool in supporting that coordinated response, and I'm delighted to be here to acknowledge the milestone of Marac in every local authority area in Scotland, and that wee animation of the map slowly turning pink was a real visual example of when we make progress and how we see that. Obviously, an animation isn't a demonstration of our progress, but the work that is being done through Maracs, through all of you and your organisations, is where that progress is. And we heard that from Helen in her video before I spoke. In 2014, the new Equally Safe Scotland strategy to address violence against women and girls recognised Maracs as invaluable. The strategy acknowledged that the working together of statutory and third sectors and multi-agency activity has been especially productive. And it is essential that we move forward, that the different roles and specialisms of the statutory and third sectors are valued and harnessed in our multi-agency approach. And move forward we will. The importance of strengthening and developing the Marac approach in Scotland is recognised in the current Short Life Equally Safe Delivery Plan. We have committed to publishing the learning report based on a series of deep dive events held with stakeholders in 2021 and creating an action plan based on stakeholder recommendations. I welcome that stakeholders again met with officials, and thank you so much for your time, your energy, your effort, your motivation and your challenge. And I know that you met with officials earlier this month to pick up the work on developing the action plan, and I'll be keeping a close eye on that and monitoring progress with great interest as well. I'm committed, absolutely committed, as is your government, to ensuring that our Equally Safe strategy continues to deliver real change. The Marac approach continues to be an important element of a response to domestic abuse in 2021, as it was in 2014, and as it is now in 2022, and will be in 2023, which is not that far away, a few weeks. On the Friday the 25th of November, the first day of the 16 days of activism, I had the great pleasure to address the North East Violence Against Women Forum. Speakers included Ryan Hart, and if you've not heard Ryan speak, please take the opportunity if you get that. Ryan's coercively controlling father murdered his mother and his sister in 2016. And we heard from Kirsty Spencer, who lost her sister Dawn Rhodes after her husband killed her in their family home. Their stories were all too familiar to all of us, but incredibly important that they have got the strength to tell us their stories as well. They provide stark messages of the harm caused to individuals, families and friends by perpetrators' actions. More powerfully still, they talked about professional responses that denied or minimised the abuse, excused the perpetrator or blamed the victim. In short, professional responses that further brutalise and dehumanise the victim survivor, professional responses that reinforce the perpetrator message, it's all her fault, no one will believe her, she will lose her children. We've all heard these things in the past. Professional responses that gaslight the victim survivor just as the perpetrator has. These are also responses that exacerbate the risk the victim survivor faces. So while we recognise and acknowledge that progress has been made in tackling domestic abuse, let's collectively hold our hands up, and I certainly do that as your government minister, and recognise the continuing journey ahead. There is absolutely no room for complacency, and hopefully the folk in the room who know me know that I'm not a complacent person and would not take that easy path. But I think it's why it's absolutely essential that we continue to work to ensure those in the public sector are equipped with the resources and knowledge to confidently and sensitively work with victim survivors and perpetrators. I know the issue of capacity building across the workforce is key to the work of Safer Lives and the work that they undertake. This will continue as actions relate to deep dive recommendations are developed, and we want to hear your voices in that in every step of the way. Furthermore, our Equally Safe in Practice project, led by Scottish Women's Aid, and thanks to Marsha and the team there, is developing a framework to equip the workforce with the knowledge, understanding and tools necessary to improve responses to violence against women. There are occasions when a perpetrator of domestic abuse kills. We know that. And such death is one too many, but sadly the figures are higher than that, so that it is essential that we keep learning. I am encouraged by the launch of our new multi-agency task force, developing a new approach to helping prevent homicides in Scotland where domestic abuse is suspected. It will help us to learn more about the circumstances around domestic abuse-related homicides. This is obviously connected to the development of Marac in Scotland, and I welcome the cross-fertilisation and learning that will strengthen our approach. Our work in this area has never been so important as we continue our efforts in really challenging times. I recognise that the COVID-19 pandemic and the cost crisis had made lives of victim survivors harder and placed enormous pressure on the services that rely on them. And I'd like to therefore thank everyone here today for all of your work on tackling domestic abuse and other forms of violence against women and girls. I want to acknowledge the enormous contribution that SafeLives make and have made to the developing of Marac in Scotland, and I hope will continue to make, and to pay tribute to the skilled, dedicated and passionate advocates for survivors. I've met many of you. You're amazing. and all of the folks that we know who work in our third sector and statutory organisations as well. When we work together, we really make a difference. And I know that your work helps and transforms lives daily. As we heard from Helen in the video, she said it saved her life. And that is, you know, a comment that people say, and it's a term that gets used often, but when we hear it from a victim survivor, it's power. It's power and how that helps us understand what you do, and the work that you do, you know, literally saves lives every single day. So I'm really grateful, and thank you for letting me to join this event today. And by attending, we are demonstrating our collective ambitions to addressing domestic abuse. I'm really grateful for you to listen to me this morning, but it's my role now to listen to you. And on that, I'll pass back to you, Jenny, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Christina, for your input and for being here today, for addressing us and for listening to well, Helen first of all, but to the rest of the speakers as well. I'm going to get the slides back up in just a minute. And next up, we're going to hear from Councillor Stephen Hiddle, who is the Vice President of COSLA. And I think it's really a testament, I think, to the commitment to Marac across Scotland that we've got both a representative of national and local government speaking here today. So over to Stephen.
Good morning. I'm delighted to be addressing you all today at this important event, and I'm grateful to SafeLives for the invitation to be involved. I'm Stephen Hiddle, and I'm a councillor and the Vice President of COSLA, which represents local government with members from all 32 councils who face very different challenges, but who all have a common purpose to do their best for the people in their council areas in what's a challenging and harsh environment at present. As co-owners of Equally Safe with the Scottish Government, it's our everyday job to demonstrate leadership in tackling gender-based violence, to use COSLA's power and influence to prevent this harm from occurring, to support recovery, and to hold individuals accountable for harms caused. Local government's committed to responding to the gendered impacts of the pandemic in our blueprint, and now the further impacts on gender equality, well-being, and safety of women as outcomes of the cost of living crisis calls upon us to continue that response. The safeguarding of victims of domestic abuse is central to tackling the dreadful harms caused by perpetrators, including lifelong damage to and the loss of some women's and children's lives. The importance of ensuring a coordinated multi-agency response and system is in place in local areas to support and protect women and children and to manage perpetrator behaviour is recognised and Equally Safe by identifying effective Marac operation as a key component in addressing violence against women and girls in Scotland. All 32 local authority areas are now engaged in the development or provision of Marac. You're about to hear more about the work in local areas that pioneered and continues to develop local approaches. You don't need me to tell you that to achieve this requires dedication, capacity, innovative and determined leadership. It also requires that local services know about and engage with Marac, that the workforce understands and recognises coercively controlling behaviours and how they impact on victims. That our schools, housing, children's services, local offices, community safety services, and many other parts of our workforce, know how and where to signpost women and children to sources of support, and who to link with to refer them to the protections that they need. And here I pause, because what we must also recognise is the intense pressure that our local services are under. Less and less funding is available to local government as a whole, and this is impacting on the flexible resources available to support the action we urgently need to take. Local governments committed to investing and responding to and mitigating against the worst harms of crisis, to protect those who have already become victims and support their recovery. However, to achieve a shift to prevention requires long-term sustainable investment. Until that investment is made, and until we fully confront the prevalence and seriousness of our problem, the public purse will continue to meet the cost of men's violence towards women and the devastating levels of harm that it causes. COSLA was a partner to the Scottish Government through a series of deep dives held in 2021 to explore some of the themes that were identified in the 2018-19 Government's consultation on how to improve multi-agency risk assessment and interventions for victims and survivors of domestic abuse, including how local arrangements could be strengthened to support the objectives of Equally Safe. Views included that adequate resources are required to support Maracs so that they can operate in a high quality way in each local authority area, that professionals within all key public sector and third sector organisations need a robust understanding of their individual and collective roles and responsibilities in relation to Maracs, that they have the knowledge, skills and support needed to fulfil these functions through collaboration and partnership, and also that improvements should be based on and built on the good practice and processes already in place in many local authority areas across Scotland. I hope this event helps us move forward, and I look forward to COSLA's continuing commitment to and engagement in supporting this ongoing work, as together we dedicate ourselves to creating a Scotland where all people can and do live equally safe lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those inputs. We are going to move on in our agenda and hear from our first guest speakers this morning, Mhairi McGowan and Lily Greenan. Mhairi is currently the lead trainer on the accredited IDA course, which is delivered in partnership between SafeLives Assist and Scottish Women's Aid, and is also working on a number of projects across Scotland in relation to domestic abuse and violence against women and girls, primarily within the justice sector. Mhairi also helped set up the first women's refuge in Greater Easterhouse in Glasgow and managed the first court-based domestic abuse advocacy service in Scotland. As head of Assist Glasgow, Mhairi was also instrumental in setting up the Glasgow Marac. Lily Greenan is also an independent violence against women and girls consultant, a freelance consultant, researcher and trainer with a focus on violence against women, gender equality and human rights. She was previously CEO of Scottish Women's Aid and is a member of the First Minister's National Advisory Council on Women and Girls. As project manager for the EVA project in North Lanarkshire, Lily was involved in setting up the North Lanarkshire Marac back in 2005, including securing the necessary strategic buy-in for the model. And we've asked Mhairi and Lily this morning to speak to you all and reflect on the setup of the first two Scottish Maracs in Glasgow and North Lanarkshire in 2005. So over to Mhairi and Lily.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. Thanks to SafeLives for asking me to come and speak. It's really important, I think, to acknowledge where we are now, but it's also important to acknowledge our history and where we've come from. So Scotland's Marac journey began when Annie Donaldson, who was the Violence Against Women Coordinator in West Dunbartonshire, attended a conference in London in 2002. Can you move on the slide, please? I'm not used to doing my own slides, it's bizarre. Sorry, thank you. And she attended a conference in London in 2002 and heard Jan Pickles, Steve Bartlett and John Lloyd talking about Marac and what they'd introduced in South Wales as a response to a number of domestic abuse murders. Annie knew that Scotland needed to hear about this, but it took nearly 2 years to sort out dates until an International Women's Day conference in March 2004 to get them here. So thank you, Annie, for your commitment. That conference was an absolute watershed for all of us who attended. I couldn't believe that a cop and a prosecutor were outlining the feminist analysis of abuse to us, their understanding of domestic abuse, of both the complexities of multi-agency cooperation and the need for a level of interagency cooperation never seen before was absolutely incredible, and it was led by their determination that women and children should not die due to the lack of sharing of information. So needless to say, there were a few huddles at the coffee break and a number of us were determined to bring Marac to Scotland. Can you move the slide, please? It's also important to understand the political context in Scotland, which was really important and interesting at that time too. The re-establishment of the Parliament in 1999 allowed a national focus that we weren't able to have before. We had feminist pals in the Parliament as MSPs, but we also had real difficulties being experienced by local women's aid groups where local authorities wanted to reduce funding. And when one local group was told their funding was being withdrawn, it became the catalyst for the very first march and lobby of the Parliament, sparked a national discussion and led to the first national strategy. But there were also huge institutional gaps. In 1999, Stuart Drury was convicted for life for the murder of Marilyn McKenna. He was released in appeal, a retrial was sought, and he was convicted for a second time in 2001. Marilyn's sister Aileen came to Greater Easterhouse Women's Aid and spoke to Mhairi and I about what had happened. 64 police officers had been at Marilyn's house over 4 years. Aileen said that Marilyn knew she was going to die. She was absolutely petrified and couldn't understand why no one listened to her. And Mhairi and I promised Aileen that we wouldn't let Marilyn's name and struggle be in vain. So at that Western Bartonshire conference, Marilyn was very much in my mind. I must also say here that Marilyn's death was the catalyst for Strathclyde Police totally changing how they dealt with domestic abuse, including starting a vulnerable persons database, the first in the UK, as they were also shocked that they couldn't track domestic abuse victims across police divisions within the same city, never mind the same force. Next slide, please. So a pilot court was announced by the Scottish Government in late 2003, and Glasgow's Sheriff Principal Bowen said they'd introduce it. The Glasgow Violence Against Women Partnership began to look at advocacy models, and the coordinator, Kath Gallagher, and I visited London and Cardiff to look at what other models there were out there. In London, we met Diana Barron, obviously, who founded SafeLives. We also went to Standing Together Against Domestic Violence and their advocacy project Advance in Hammersmith and Fulham, where they had a domestic abuse court and introduced what they called a multi-agency action planning process. But the depth of cooperation in London wasn't the same as Cardiff. So Assist was set up over the summer. Deb Nicholson joined as its first coordinator for the first year, and the court began in October. So the model we used was very much based on Advance in the Women's Safety Unit. We used the same paperwork, the same risk assessment known as the FSU9. We secured funding for an evaluation of Assist by Amanda Robinson of Cardiff Uni, who was already working on an updated risk assessment model for South Wales Police, and the Assist findings fed directly into that, and what came out of that was Dash. Deb started the Assist Bulletin as a way of keeping the multi-agency advisory group informed of what's happening, and just on a weekly basis. But she quickly realised that it was Assist that held the full picture of the level of risk that clients faced. She would email the police on a Friday afternoon to tell them about anyone she was worried about, but there was no real shared understanding of risk. So multi-agency risk management became a feature of the bulletin as a way of making the risk visible and transparent, and gaps in institutional processes can still be seen in that bulletin today. But we still felt we were operating in isolation without a Marac. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, there was only resources for one Marac, and we were really disappointed to lose out to North Lanarkshire, especially as we had the court and the advocacy model. A Marac was the last spoke of the wheel. But in true Assist fashion, we decided to go ahead ourselves with the backing of our multi-agency advisory group. So we embarked on a series of briefings. We took it to the Chief Officers Group and got agreement at all levels. We decided that people attending should be at a level to make decisions, but crucially that they knew the cases being talked about what safety measures would work for that individual family. We couldn't get agreement for criminal justice social work to attend, but with police, children and families, social work, education, housing, health via health visiting and assist. So we decided to have a dry run in June 2005, using 3 or 4 real cases with members of the Violence Against Women Partnership there too, to see the process they'd only heard about. However, despite the domestic abuse knowledge in the room, the meeting very quickly deteriorated to a focus on her decisions, her parenting skills, and the actions and the impact of the perpetrator were invisible. We stopped the meeting after hearing 2 cases. The learning was how much work we had to do before we did it again, and the importance of having criminal justice there as the people who worked with the perpetrators of domestic abuse. It took a further 6 months before we felt confident to proceed, but there was still an awful lot of challenge, gentle and robust, during the meetings at the beginning. Next slide, please. That was also the case when Assist started to roll out Maracs in other areas of Strathclyde, especially in areas where criminal justice were not in attendance, but areas came round. The discussions we had then proved the points made in the Marac research that unless you've got the whole picture, a Marac will not be effective. But we were doing all the coordination work ourselves. We were unfunded to do that. It was just something we took on because we knew it was important. But we couldn't continue to do that on our own. We tried to get other agencies to take over with varying success. We were also criticised for not rolling it out to every area we covered, but without funding, our hands were tied. We were also operating on a flat budget. So year on year, things were getting harder and tighter, and eventually we just had to stop doing it. But that didn't mean our commitment to the process was lost. So we approached SafeLives and applied to the Scottish Government for funding for a Marac development worker, which was successful, and well, here we are. So I'll pass to Lily. Thank you.
Thanks, Barry, and thanks to SafeLives for inviting us to talk about the early days. In North Lanarkshire, could I have the next slide, please? In North Lanarkshire, the context was a wee bit different. We had a domestic abuse working group operating at a strategic level since 1999, and parallel to that was the establishment of the EVA project, which sat within NHS Lanarkshire. And as a project, it had an odd twin operational strategic remit, even in its first 3 years as a SIP-funded project. And so although the project was delivering services, there was also a remit to look at where the service gaps were and to look at how to improve service responses. The challenges that we were experiencing in North Lanarkshire were very definitely around how to get that coordination of responses to domestic abuse at an operational level. There was very limited joint working between agencies unless there were child protection issues. And we'd been talking about how to change that for quite a while before the Western Bartonshire Conference came up in March 2004. By we, I mean those of us at EVA, Helen Snedden, who was the coordinator and still is the Violence Against Women coordinator in North Lanarkshire, and sort of a few folk who were involved in the strategic partnership, but also had an operational oversight. So we were looking at what we could do to change it. Can I have the next slide? Thanks. On the day of the Western Bartonshire Conference, I was in at least one of those huddles, if not several, because we were all a bit blown away by just the extent to which coordination had been achieved between the agencies in South Wales from the way it was described. And those of us from North Lanarkshire felt like that this could be it. This could be the thing we'd been looking for that would really help us to operationalise the coordination of responses to domestic abuse to the direct benefit of survivors. We were doing well at a strategic level. We were looking at what policies and procedures do you need in place strategically, but we weren't getting the impact on the ground for individual survivors that we all felt was needed. So in late September, October, a small group of us did what I would call a study visit to Cardiff, and met with the agencies that were involved there. Jan from the Women's Safety Unit, the Crown the CPS rep, the police, and then sort of attended a Marac and got a real feel for how it could work and where some of the differences were going to be if we were trying to introduce it in North Lanarkshire. We were, sorry Mhairi, we got the money. We were fortunate in having someone who was tapped into the community safety funding process at the Scottish Executive, and we put in a bid supported by Strathclyde Police to get some money to cover the coordination costs, and a seconded police officer to provide the advocacy support. By that stage, local women's aid groups were focused largely on refuge and outreach services, and a lot of police and sort of fiscal related advocacy was sitting or had been sitting with the EVA project, and we were short of a staff member to keep that going. So the seconded police officer was the solution to that. And we started running briefing meetings. Helen and myself, as I recall in my notebooks from the time seemed to support it, spent an awful lot of time going around talking to people about Maracs and working on bringing down some of the barriers that were there. There were some suspicions about how an approach like that could work. There was a lot of concern, particularly amongst social work colleagues, about potential blurring of boundaries with child protection processes, which is where most people were focused in relation to risk at the time. Criminal justice social work didn't like it at all. Initially, there was a real difficulty in engaging there. And again, some of that was natural concern, because if you've got a professional approach to a particular issue, it's hard to take on a new way of doing it. And it took a while to get people interested enough to, in July 2005, do a second stage study visit. And that one was the people that we needed on board. That was sort of representatives from the police, social work, health, the children's reporter, did a visit to Cardiff, and they came back convinced. And that really, really helped us to move forward. We had our agency reps in place by the early November. One of the difficulties that I remember us having was ensuring that we had someone at the table, or who was going to be at the table, who had the right level of decision-making authority, but wasn't so far removed from operational work that they didn't really have a sense of how things worked on the ground. And we had, I would say, there were a couple of changes in the Marac makeup that helped to resolve that over time, but I don't know that we had that quite right at the very beginning. The first Marac was the 24th of November 2005. It started, can I have the next slide? This is at the time was N Division of Strathclyde Police, and it was agreed that we would roll it out across the 4 subdivisions starting in Bellshill. So we rolled it out gradually. I've put this note saying training on risk assessment at shift changes. So the shift change briefing was a 35-minute briefing, and I think we got 20 minutes of that, in which to explain to frontline responders what they were going to do now when they went to a call out to a domestic abuse incident, explain how to do the risk assessment, and show them the wallet card that we were providing them with. That was the training. I'm a bit horrified now that we prepared them so badly, and quite surprised that despite that, there was implementation. It did happen. The issue that we had not foreseen, because we were basing our assumptions about the numbers of high-risk cases we might expect to see out of any given number of incidents over the course of a month. We'd based it on what was happening in South Wales. And what we hadn't foreseen was the role that alcohol played in call-outs and incidents. Not the role that alcohol plays in domestic abuse, but simply the number of incidents that police attended where alcohol use was a feature for either the victim, the perpetrator, or both, or the alleged victims, perpetrators. 85% of the incidents that police were called to in that first run came through as high risk because alcohol was involved. And that was much higher. I think at the time Cardiff might have been somewhere around 20% or less than, and we hadn't counted on there being such a big difference. Don't know if that would be the same picture today in North Lanarkshire, and Helen might have thoughts about that and whether it's changed. But at the time, it sort of blew a hole in our expectations about what the workload would be, because we just had a lot more cases. Can I have the next slide? We had a lot more cases, and we're back to the final thoughts here, Barry. Very different developments because of different contexts. Glasgow had the court and assist, so a whole project focused on advocacy. In North Lanarkshire, we didn't have a court system set up, and we'd had earlier in the partnerships life, there had been some resistance from the fiscal service to the notion of any kind of specialism or special case being made, but they had come round. But Barry, do you want to pick up from there and talk a bit about some of the reflections?
I think it was really interesting listening to, talking to people in Wales, to Diana, to Amanda about the issues that were different in Scotland. They were amazed at the level of reporting to the police, because we had at that time a breach of the peace offence, which they didn't have in England and Wales. There was the issue about alcohol, as Lily said. I can understand, I can remember discussions with Amanda around that as well. It was really a really interesting and focused few years. But I think what really held us back was that lack of acknowledgement about how much the coordination and the evaluation was necessary. When we visited Standing Together in London, then they had the level of evaluation and coordination, the data collection that was getting pulled out at the time was absolutely incredible, and we had none of that. And I think that has definitely held us back. I think there are still gaps in our processes. I still read the assist bulletin every week, and there are some weeks that I'm tearing my hair out because I can see the same gaps that we've seen week in, week out for years. But we can also see progress, and there has been incredible progress. And to get to a situation where we are now, where we've got Maracs in every local authority, it's absolutely crucial. But I want to finish by going back to what Helen said, because what she said is absolutely true, and that's where we need to go next. It's the introduction of evaluation and standards that are absolutely crucial. And until we do that, I don't think we will be able really to see the total effect. But my hopes are still high that the advisory group that's sitting and the progress that's been made, that will come. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Barry and Lily, for your reflections and for that input. Great to hear about where it all started, and we need to remember where we've come from to be able to move forward and to think about what next steps are. And I think hearing about your reflections on the need for both that kind of strategic and operational support and embedding of the model, I think are things that we're still talking about and we're still maybe perhaps not getting fully right. And we need to continue to learn from what we've done so far and what's worked and what's perhaps not worked. Also great to just hear about all the brilliant contributions from across the sector and all the people who've been involved in getting us to where we are. So thanks for recognising those people as well. And thanks for contributing to the event today. We are actually running ahead of schedule, which is, I think, unheard of in one of these events, but we're going to go to the coffee break either way. And I think if we can all come back at, let's say, 10 to 11, and we'll have our next speaker from Fife Marac join us then. So we'll have a wee coffee break, and you'll have a chance to have a comfort break, get a cuppa, and then we'll be back at 10 to 11. Thanks, everyone. Okay, we're going to get started back up. I hope you've managed to get a cup of tea and have a wee comfort break. Thanks so much for all your reflections and comments in the chat as well. And just a reminder again to pop any questions that you have for any of the speakers in the Q&A function, because we'll keep monitoring that throughout the event, and we'll come back to them at the end of the event for a wee Q&A session with the speakers. But it's really brilliant to just see all of the reflections and to hear all the great responses to Mhairi and Lily's input earlier, just before the break. We're going to go to Fife now, and we're going to hear from Jess Denniff, who is the Marac coordinator for Fife Marac. She oversees the day-to-day operation of the Fife Marac, and will be sharing some learning from Fife around operational and strategic oversight for Marac and the lessons learned along the way in the past 10 years of Marac operation across Fife, including some learning from some recent evaluation work that they've been doing. So over to you, Jess, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Jenny, and to SafeLives for hosting this event and giving me the opportunity to talk about Marac in Fife alongside the other speakers on the agenda. Already from this morning, it's been completely fascinating to hear from everyone, the range of speakers that we have, and obviously the range of knowledge and experience that remains held in the development of Marac, which I think is really special. In my role as a Marac coordinator in Fife, I work daily alongside a range of wonderful colleagues and services to ensure that our highest risk domestic abuse victims are made safer. And as such, this presentation reflects their work, as well as the work of those previously involved and instrumental in its development. Thank you again also for everyone that's come along today to mark what is a really significant milestone for Scotland. And with that, I'll start my timer to keep myself on check. Glad to hear that we're doing well with timings this morning. And if we go on to the next slide. Thanks, Steph. In terms of my input this morning, I've been asked, as Jenny said, to focus on how Fife, a well-established Marac in Scotland, has developed in more than a decade of operation. My input today will have a focus on how our operational and strategic setups help us deliver good service locally, and I'll cover the 4 points on the slide here, wrapping up in just under 20 minutes. If we go on to the next slide for me. Thank you. So obviously we've got a timeline on the screen here, and like the other speakers, I did just want to briefly explore the development of Marac in Fife because I think it provides some of the context and insights into our operational and strategic setup, and obviously our successes that come from that. As you'll see on the screen, in Fife, we first heard a case on October 14th, 2010. That was case 1. We'll hear our 3000th case next week at our last Marac of 2022. As anyone involved in the operational side of Marac will be aware, of course, 3000 cases does not account for the full picture. And in Fife, we've had over 6,500 distinct referrals in total over the past 12 years. There's, of course, many milestones in the development of Fife's Marac, or any Marac, and today I'll pick out and cover just some of those in the presentation. It can't be comprehensive, of course. On the screen, we've got just 2 of many: the development of our oversight and operational groups, and latterly the response to COVID-19 and our most recent Marac evaluation. As Jenny mentioned, there's been a few in Fife, and I'll try and do justice to some of the key points from these, but our most recent one was in 2020. A timeline beginning with case number 1 does, of course, not paint a full picture. And if we go back to the development of Marac in Fife, we can find lessons for now. So I'll run through some of those lessons at the end of the presentation. And I know that Jenny will be picking up on some of the key themes as well from all of the speakers. In terms of the bit that comes before this timeline, then the bit before 2010, we know from Mhairi and Lily's presentation that Marac was first established in Wales. A presentation and evaluation from Wales were given at a Scottish conference by Wales, and North Lanarkshire became our first Marac in Scotland. Fife, having closely followed these developments, invited Lanarkshire's Helen Snedden and the Marac police sergeant from the area to a Fife conference called Opening Doors in 2009. And it was here in 2009 that the process started for Fife. Fife's then head of adult services and the chair of Fife Violence Against Women Partnership at this time were really instrumental in getting the support going for the idea of a Marac in Fife. Other key players at that point were senior managers from Education, Police Scotland, Housing, Women's Aid, and the Rape and Sexual Assault Centre. It was these initial kind of key people that became our Marac Oversight Group, Strategic Oversight Group, or SOG, formalised at the time with a remit laid down in 2011, as you can see on my slide there. Fife secured the funds from a Violence Against Women fund for a feasibility study, which kind of speaks to what Lily and Mhairi were also talking about. So a trial, a feasibility study. And in Fife, this looked like a police officer being seconded from the domestic abuse unit, as it was then, before the development of a fully funded Marac coordinator post. So Marac was new in Scotland, and speaking to people that were part of the design of this at that time, highlighted there wasn't really a national network or national resources to tap into. So some of this was quite ad hoc, developed as it went, and really laid the groundwork for other Maracs. There was a huge amount of work with different partners around this time to establish a working arrangement that fitted the needs of Marac and also all the partners' own time pressures and arrangements. So buy-in and making it work was obviously essential, as it remains now, to the development of any sustainable Marac. It's essential to make sure that when developing something new, that it fits the needs of what you're trying to develop, but also those that you're trying to get involved. After the decision to develop Marac in Fife was secured and made, funding and the nuts and bolts of getting that process up and running became the focus, as you can imagine. Police Scotland offered a Marac sergeant at this point, and the Violence Against Women coordinator worked closely to develop Marac with him. That sergeant developed information sharing protocols and processes, and the Violence Against Women partnership took the lead, liaising with managers and seeking funding. Management buy-in was secured and a basic process was outlined, with key practitioners invited to a meeting to discuss in detail what was hoped to be achieved. It was agreed to try the process with just 3 cases, again, very similar to what Mhairi was telling us earlier, just the 3 cases a Marac to begin with. There was obviously some anxiety about what was being trialled, and it was important to get it right. So a trial with a small number of cases made sense to accurately sense what could be achieved through this. The outcome of that, again, speaking to people that were involved at the time in preparation for this, practitioners liked the opportunity to meet and discuss cases face to face in that multi-agency setting, which was quite new for a lot of people involved at that point. It was proved to be a learning experience for all partners, and it was noted that a much better understanding of each other's role and a sense of what could or couldn't be done and why that was the case developed, which is obviously a key factor in multi-agency work and of course essential when we're discussing high-risk domestic abuse. Some of this stuff seems obvious now, but perhaps at the time was being developed and was actually was quite new. The next focus really, obviously, after that trial became sustainable funding, and a lot of these will ring true for anyone developing more recent Maracs and going through some of these stages now. So advocacy, as we know, is the key voice of the victim at Marac. And also business and administrative support are essential to the smooth and safe running of Maracs. We all know that, but to achieve that, funding is needed. The police had provided Marac coordination at various points in the early days with police officers that were not on frontline duties, seconded to the role, but obviously that lacked consistency. You would have someone come in for a few months of time and then leave back to frontline duties. So later that became an additional civilian post, which provided a little bit more continuity. Initially funded by the Community Safety Partnership and Alcohol and Drug Partnership, a competitive process was begun for Marac advocacy to see who would provide that service, and Fife Women's Aid began to provide that service after success in that. Funding was also sourced through the Big Lottery Fund initially for this advocacy. A Marac coordinator and support assistant were funded by Housing, Social Work, Education and NHS in equal part, and the police continued to provide a Marac sergeant. Obviously, it's all well and good for me to kind of sum up that in a couple of sentences and say this is how it happened, but as anyone that's had a hand in this would know, that takes a huge amount of effort and graft and work by all those involved and commitment to actually get all of these people to fund something and see the benefit of it. So all of this work going on before we even kind of heard case one. All of this work allowed Fife Marac to get off the ground and begin identifying and helping high-risk victims of domestic abuse, which of course is essential. There was then the continued development and maintenance of Marac to consider. So if we move on to the next slide. Thanks, Steph. As Jenny made clear in the introduction, I've obviously been asked today to talk about the operational and strategic setup in Fife after its initial creation, which I've just kind of run through there. SafeLives recommends an operational group and strategic group distinctly operating, so operating separately, but feeding into one another, reporting to one another, and that's exactly what we have in Fife. So in Fife, all the agencies submit information, all the agencies, apologies, that submit information to the Marac or attend the actual Marac meetings will attend the 3 monthly operational group. That's represented on the left of my slide under the blue heading. And all the topics discussed there, they range from things like examples of best practice, highlighting changes that are needed, maybe changes to documentation, information requests, so the information we ask for from partners, and much more besides. The meetings are always well attended, contributed to. They always run the full length of time that we have them scheduled for whenever struggling for agenda items, and we generally see the benefit of coming together. That was just made even more clear in COVID when the actual Marac meetings moved online, and so it became essential to create that space for people to meet face to face who had a hand in Marac and maybe meet new colleagues as well. On the right, we've got the Strategic Oversight Group, which also operates every 3 months and is made up of service managers generally from across the Marac partners. It's currently chaired by a Detective Chief Inspector and the Head of Public Protection for Police Scotland in Fife. And the chair changes every 2 years with membership reviewed regularly. At the Strategic Oversight Group, again, that kind of higher level management level group, the success of Marac is really measured and monitored. So we currently have 4 aims: the victims feeling safer, reduced repeat victimisation, and newly added this year, the provision of training and awareness raising, thirdly, and fourthly, tasking. Just by way of example, because some of this is obviously quite abstract, tasking was highlighted in Fife Marac as needing improvement when we had an incompletion rate of the tasks set at Marac of around 8%. So 8% of tasks weren't being reported back on, and we weren't entirely sure if they'd been completed, even though they'd been set at a Marac meeting. With the oversight group's push to solve this, and obviously noticing the data, the operational group and Marac team were able to really quickly reduce this to less than 0.5%. It now sits at 0.3 and is reducing. It improved the focus at Marac meetings on what is an appropriate and doable task, which will ring true to anyone that has sat in a Marac meeting or come across the tasking and action side of it. It's an example also of the strategic oversight group and operational group working together, which is why I've included it here and given it time. And the resourcing of Marac as well is obviously essential to that. If you've got enough people and power behind the team to actually reduce some of the problems and put time aside for it, then that's how you achieve those things. As this slide also makes clear, other strategic groups and legislation influence Marac's operation and ensures that we don't operate in a silo. It's really useful to have the operational group and strategic group talk to one another and share ideas and findings and challenge each other. But we can't operate entirely in that silo. So in the middle here, we've got Chief Officers Public Safety Group, executive committees, and obviously public protection and data protection legislation. This isn't a fully comprehensive list of the things that also feed into our setup, but it would be a very heavy slide if I tried to include them all. So if we move on to the next slide. Thank you very much. I thought it would be useful here, obviously, having been asked to look at the operational and strategic groups and how we operate in Fife, I thought it would be useful to look at some of the themes that have come up in Fife and what works about our setup. So these are the themes displayed on the slide. I've put 5 of them in here. I'm sure there would be more. So just to give each its due briefly. Firstly, the sustainability I've included here. It took some teasing out to kind of work out what I thought were some of the key themes and conversations with colleagues as well. But sustainability really has been essential, and it's been a strength of Fife Marac. It's what's allowed us to continue. Leadership buy-in has been absolutely critical, which to me means continuing to evidence the value of Marac to partners in Fife. It's one thing highlighting the need to address domestic abuse and the risks for victims and children affected, and of course that's essential. But so is demonstrating to managers that the processes in place and Marac can support their staff and help meet their service objectives as well. That's multi-agency working. Highlighting the challenges to elected members and getting them on board with what we've been doing and understanding the impact of domestic abuse on women and children has been essential, and working with elected members to their goals. By way of example for this, sustainability-wise, negotiating funds with statutory partners after the ending of the big lottery funding for our advocacy really required leadership buy-in. It wasn't guaranteed, it wasn't stumped up immediately, but through negotiations with statutory partners, we managed to fill that gap when charitable funding drew back, and that was in 2019. Sustainability also means having the right people involved in Marac at both that operational and strategic level. So partners who want to see Marac thrive and are confident enough to spot the issues, suggest improvements, and actually challenge the status quo are essential. And we do have those in Fife. Moving on to that second kind of theme that I've tried to pick out here, evaluations and feedback have been a real focus across Maracs in Scotland. In Fife, frequent evaluations through external consultancies, SafeLives observations, and most recently, as I touched on, that internal review in 2019, that allows recommendations and meaningful change to occur, and an independent look at Marac. If you work right up against it and you're kind of at the coalface, it's really difficult sometimes to take a step back, or I've found that myself, and will put my hands up to that. So these recommendations and evaluations are exceptionally useful. They consistently also evidence, which I think is worth mentioning here, the value of continuing with Marac. So often in evaluations, it comes back and says, this should continue, it's vital, it's a service that should continue. And I don't think that can be understated. People might just look at evaluations as being, this needs to change and this needs to change, but actually consistently it comes up quite how vital Marac is, and also the role of advocacy. So victim advocacy as being essential to that. Marac really would be barely anything without that. So the victims' feedback has been at the heart of the strategic oversight group's monitoring of the Marac process as well, which just further embeds that. As I said earlier, victims feeling safer is one of two outcomes that has been in place for Marac in Fife across the decade. Feedback sourced from Women's Aid, Fife Women's Aid, shortly after Marac meetings from victims is a hugely valuable insight into our performance, and it gives an immediate sense of how we're doing. So it's sourced within sort of 4 to 6 weeks after the Marac. Last year, 85% of our female victims giving feedback said that they felt safer shortly after their case had come to Marac. So that's 85% feeling safer. 96% of female Marac victims said that the safety planning had helped them. The feedback from male victims is not carried out by Women's Aid, and is at present more anecdotal and qualitative for us in Fife, partly because of numbers and partly because of our setup. So that is a focus for us going forward. But those numbers, as I said, hugely insightful for us. And feedback from those working within Marac, again, is valuable. Changes to processes and how we do things evolves all the time. There isn't an operational group that goes by without us tweaking something here or changing something there, and that's a good thing. Honest conversations about professional challenges and issues occur when needed, and again, that can only be a good thing. This obviously links into my next kind of theme that I'd picked out on here, which is the operational processes. A recent decision that we made in Fife to trial a face-to-face Marac after the COVID online cases, a revamp of the information requested at Marac, and the addition of new social work representatives from the adult service are just 3 examples of changes that we've made in the past month alone. In Fife, we've been good at reviewing and adapting, and through the full-time Marac coordinator and social work assistant posts, we have the resources to keep an eye on best practice, engage with national forums and new work going on elsewhere. We're not necessarily exceptional in that point, but we are well resourced, and that cannot be understated. In terms of outcomes here, kind of four themed I'd pick out. The main outcome of the Marac is, of course, to identify high-risk domestic abuse victims successfully and work in a multi-agency fashion to reduce that risk, thus making victims and families safer. And in Fife, our clear outcomes decided on by the Strategic Oversight Group, noted on the slide, and as I mentioned earlier, allow us to have a clear sense of what we're aiming for and what should work, what should look good. These outcomes are provided data year on year and give us a clear steer as to what's going well and needs improving. And finally, I've left space for the future here. This event's been a wonderful chance to reflect on the strengths of Marac across Scotland, their histories, the lessons learned along the way, and the hard work of people in the development of them. But a focus operationally and strategically on the future is also really essential, and how we can continue to support our victims, reducing the risk within the context, as the Vice President of COSLA said earlier, of changing resources as well. For example, we managed to successfully adapt during COVID and change things as we needed, but strong partnerships, review, reflection, and supporting the future are all requirements going forward. If I could have the next slide. Thank you. So we've come a really long way since we first considered case one in Marac Fife in 2010, and it's been an enormously positive experience for those involved, learning from each other, improving the multi-agency responses for our highest risk victims, and also more generally learning how to work in a multi-agency fashion. Over 3,000 cases have been heard at Marac, with the aim always to provide the best response we can for each, whether that means going the extra mile to provide a more unorthodox task, staying a little later to sort something, attempting to contact the victim just once more or in a different way, and making sure that things are joined up when they didn't appear to be and we just want to double check. All of these things are essential. And thinking about some of the themes and strengths and weaknesses in Fife, I thought some of the strengths that we've touched on already, but just by way of summing up really and to hammer these home, we now have, touch wood, sustainable funding in Marac in Fife for Marac. We've increased the number of referrals and cases heard at Marac from that initial 3 per Marac to around 10 to 15 now. COVID has demonstrated the adaptability of partners and processes, and ongoing evaluations and reviews continue to guide us to make improvements. We've got a robust screening process in Fife, which is slightly outside of the SafeLives model, but does show local vision and adaptability. Trust, honesty, good communications, and that oversight, as I've said, have been absolutely vital throughout. The ability to have challenging conversations and pick up on things that could be done better has been a real strength for Fife. Even in the 2 years that I've been here, it's been evident throughout. Good reports, data collection, picking up on trends within these have been vital. Mhairi had mentioned in her presentation about data collection and some of that being really essential, and it is a strength of Fife. We have been able to have that historic look and see trends that have changed and things that have improved. Having the voluntary and statutory partners on board throughout and the commitment of those partners really cannot be understated. It's the key strength of Marac in Fife and any Marac really, the buy-in of the right people and them consistently being involved. As I spoke of earlier, of course, looking to the future and how we improve is essential, and we should look at areas for development. So in Fife, these include not being able to take as many cases in Fife as SafeLives recommend, which for us would be about 630 per annum. At present, it's between kind of 450, 480. So that's an improvement for us to look at. Marac could be more closely aligned to child protection processes. Our Safe and Together training is slightly patchy in some places across Fife. A lot of these themes will probably ring true with other people, or I hope they will anyway. There's still poor relations in terms of public protection processes at that national and local level. And we have to improve these to ensure that no one disappears through the cracks because they're being heard in one public protection forum, such as Marac, and not another. And that goes for victims and perpetrators of domestic abuse. Feedback for those not engaged by Marac is really the million-dollar question. So how to get constructive feedback from victims who did not have a positive experience with Marac. Obviously from Helen in the Authentic Voice Panel, who we heard from earlier, we know that SafeLives has been instrumental with that, and victims have victims and survivors have lent their voices, experience, and invaluable expertise to that, but there's still gaps for us in Fife around that and how we grapple with that. And so finally, if we go on to my next slide, the single thread running through today's presentations and speakers is obviously a commitment to end domestic abuse and improve the safety and lives of victims. And so I'd like to include their feedback on Fife Marac here. A survivor reflecting on her experience of Marac and the supports that she offered this year said simply, "I managed to get away when I thought I would die." And finally, another from last year's feedback, if we move on, sourced from Fife Women's Aid, at the heart of Maracs across Scotland is a will for victims referred to Marac to feel this. It's a combination of operational excellence and strong strategic governance, the dedication of all partners as individuals and services that achieves someone feeling like this. They're amazed at the help available. Nothing seemed too much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jess, for those reflections from Fife Marac, and in particular, just hearing the words from survivors there at the end, just kind of how it hammers home, doesn't it, why we're here today, why we're doing what we're doing, and why we need to continue to look at and improve our processes. So thank you so much for your input, and really great to hear about all the really strong commitment to the Marac model in Fife and the great processes that you've got in place there. And I'm sure there will be those in the audience who will be jealous of the structures that you've got in place, but there's lots of learning there as well for all of us. We're going to move on to our next input, which comes to us from Ayrshire, which is our newest Maracs in Scotland. So we're going to hear next from Mhairi McHarg, who's the Marac coordinator for the Ayrshire Marac, and Dale Meller, who's a senior manager in protection and learning in East Ayrshire. Mandy is a retired detective chief inspector, having served 30 years with Police Scotland, where she worked within a number of specialist public protection teams, including the Domestic Abuse Investigation Unit. During her time with Police Scotland, she was involved in numerous multi-agency discussions and was involved in the scoping and proposal for the Ayrshire Marac, along with other key stakeholders. Mandy is currently one of 2 part-time Marac coordinators who support the Maracs across Ayrshire. Dale is a qualified social worker with a varied experience across local authority, NHS and national government settings, mainly working in adult services and particularly mental health. Dale is currently a senior manager in East Ayrshire with a remit around public protection and learning and development. Providing local leadership in relation to the East Ayrshire Violence Against Women Partnership, Dale was involved in the scoping and proposal for the Ayrshire Marac with other key partners in 2020 and is now supporting the implementation of our newest Scottish Marac. So over to Dale and Mandy.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you to SafeLives for the invitation. It's been fantastic this morning to hear some of the great inputs and some of the journey of Marac that we have come into probably towards the end, when you see the kind of map that we set out there in pink. So this morning, Dale and I are just going to touch on our journey here in Ayrshire. I'm going to speak for a few minutes first, and I'm going to hand over to Dale and then kind of come back to myself at the end. So if you can go to the first slide, please, that would be great. Thank you. So as I said, what we're going to touch on is really what we did in Ayrshire before we had Marac, some of the work we did undertaking the scoping exercise, how we implemented the Marac across Ayrshire, and some of our kind of early small pieces of learning and some of our early data. You can just go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So just in terms of a kind of organisational position for those of you who don't know Ayrshire, we have 3 local authorities, East, South and North Ayrshire. We've got obviously Police Scotland, who sit as a universal service, as we also have one health board, NHS, Ayrshire and Aram. And we've got the 3 Violence Against Women partnerships who sit within the 3 local authority areas. It's been really helpful this morning to kind of hear and reflect back and the journey of Marac and how challenging it was probably for some of the kind of earlier partnerships and kind of coordination teams to get set up. But I suppose just to kind of take a step back from and where our journey began really the last few years, And when I reflect back on the challenges in partnership working, one of the things that was probably quite prevalent and evident in Ayrshire was we had quite a high degree of partnership working within all of these kind of services, and also with the commission services that sat within them. We had the benefit of having co-located partnerships in the police office. So we had Assist co-located. We had a multi-agency domestic abuse response team where we had a social worker, health and housing sitting alongside a kind of police concern hub, which is now morphed into a multi-agency kind of sharing hub. And so we had a degree of quasi arrangements around about identifying high risk victims. But obviously we recognised that it probably wasn't to the same degree as what Marac offered, and we continued to advocate for Marac within Ayrshire. There was some challenges with the delivery and the consistency across some of the groups that were there in terms of the resource, the funding arrangements, and as always happens, the landscape changes and things develop and change into something else. So sometime around about the end of 2018, 2019, round about the time of the Scottish Government kind of consultation again in Marac, the leads who had come together and had quite a number of discussions round about Marac in those kind of preceding years came back together again. And we then discussed, you know, the need for Marac and what our arrangements were and whether we still felt there was a need or any gap. And it was quite clear from the discussions that, yeah, there was probably a potential gap there that Marac needed probably to address within Ayrshire. And so we sent and developed a proposal which went up through the 3 violence against women groups up at the chief officer groups, really seeking a mandate to scope out the implementation of Marac within Ayrshire. Unfortunately, as has been mentioned before, the pandemic came along and really kind of impacted the progression of that at the particular time. However, we did set up and stand up some really key operational oversight groups, which really focused actually the hidden harm that sat behind domestic abuse. And so we were really keen to then push on and get Marac developed and implemented through Ayrshire. So at this point, I'm just going to hand over to Dale, because she was absolutely instrumental and key in taking forward the kind of implementation phase. So I'll hand over to Dale at this particular point.
Thank you, Mandy, and hello, colleagues. Steph, would you mind moving on to the next slide? Thank you. So as Mandy's taken us up to the point of the pandemic, and actually sort of reflecting back, the pandemic was really helpful and instrumental for us, because we were meeting in a public protection focus during the pandemic in a way that we wouldn't normally do. And that meant that our chief officers were really keyed into issues around violence against women and girls. So we really capitalised on that. So we picked up the scoping work on the back of the scoping in 2019 to pick that back up in 2020. Being here today is amazing because we have benefited from all of the work that's gone before, and naturally, as a group of partners, we undertook research, had a look at what was going on elsewhere, close partners sort of down in the Central Belt particularly, but also we engaged really quickly with SafeLives in 2020 to start the scoping work. We got 5 people basically in a virtual room, the key statutory partners at that point, so police, NHS and the 3 local authority leads, but we engaged with Women's Aid and Assist, because we've got Assist in Ayrshire as well, and we undertook a piece of scoping work over 6 months, and that part of that involved some local data scoping to try and estimate the number of high-risk cases we might anticipate. We obviously had the benefit of the SafeLives estimated data, but we really wanted to try and work that out a bit better locally so that we could then identify the resources that we might need for our Marac meetings. So in partnership with Assist and Women's Aid, we gathered data for high-risk cases over a 3-month period, initially 1 month, and then we thought, no, we need to run this for longer. And it was imperfect, but it certainly gave us a really good indication of the potential level of need. And over 3 months, there were 215 potential referrals that we would have identified. What that then enabled us to do as the local kind of scoping group was to think about scale and the resources that might be required. Because, as Mandy's described, we have 3 local authorities and then 1 overarching health board and 1 overarching police authority, we really put together what the options might be for delivery of Marac. And we had kind of 3 options really. One was a great big Marac for everybody, but we knew from that local data that that would be an unfeasibly large meeting of potentially up to 80 sort of cases a month. We then looked at separate Maracs, 1 for each local authority area. And then the last option, which was the one that we then resourced and properly worked up, was Ayrshire-wide hosting and support and coordination with 3 local meetings. And that was the proposal that we put forward. The other thing that we debated in that scoping phase was hosting arrangements for coordination. So again, the benefit of looking across Scotland for colleagues here, we quickly identified that we needed one of the Ayrshire-wide organisations to host. And what we put forward in the proposal was that our NHS colleagues would host. There's a structure of public protection in NHS Ayrshire and Arran that would have supported that, and we got buy-in through the senior staff there. So we wrote all of that up, and I think colleagues have already commented on the work that goes into putting together a committee paper or a cabinet paper. We finalised that in June 2021. And then we managed to get all of our chief officers from the 3 areas, police and health, into a virtual room in July 2021, and we didn't let them leave until they agreed, which they did. And with that agreement came the mandate for the governance arrangements and the mandate for the resources that we'd identified in our scoping work. Next slide, please, Steph. Thanks. So then on the back of the chief officer agreement, we then went into what we've called implementation phase. We set up a wider multi-agency implementation group that involved our key voluntary sector partners and brought some new local authority folk around the table, but we had good continuity in terms of NHS and Police Scotland. And we met monthly and we really looked at all of the processes and policies, information that we needed to pull together. Hosting within the NHS also provided consistency around implementation. So because our coordination team is hosted by the NHS, we did the work there to develop the job descriptions, again with the benefit of partners around the table here today to pull together the roles properly. We developed all of our governance and paperwork as well. So we developed an information sharing agreement, service level agreement and local procedures, both for sort of the operation and for our for guidance for practitioners and participants in Marac meetings. We established our team. Mandy is here as a result of that, and our chairing is consistently through Police Scotland. So that's the model that we have in Ayrshire. So our setup is now that every month there are 3 local Maracs. We have what Jess was describing 3 times at the moment, and I think we might need to think about how we do that. So that's the operational groups, which is the local agency reps groups. They also meet monthly. That's mainly around support and implementation, but we'll probably move on to become more strategic. We launched our training and development activities, and we developed our communication strategy. Very similar to Mhairi, Lily and Jess's experience, we did trial or mock Maracs through June and July. That enabled the 3 local meetings to kind of identify glitches, think about how we would record actions and responsibilities in the meetings. And then our whole Marac went live from the 1st of August. To date, we've held 11 meetings across Ayrshire, so 3 every month. They're in a rhythm now, and to date there have been 145 cases discussed. But as Jess has pointed out, that's not a true representation of need, because there are more referrals than cases that proceed to Marac. So that's taken us up to date. I'm going to hand back to Mandy, who's going to reflect on some of the things we've learned. Thanks, Mandy.
Thanks, Dale. Yeah, and I think Dale mentioned this, and I think it's probably worth just echoing in reflection. We've really had the benefit here in Ayrshire of all the Marac learning, the best practice, and a big thank you to all our coordinator colleagues and SafeLives who we've plagued with questions and how to and what do you do with. So we've had lots of support to try and get our Marac up and running and operational. But as well as some of the benefits of the good practice, things that have really worked, we've also understood and been able to take cognizance of the things that were challenges and the barriers that we could try and consider, so that we thought about those in advance. We've very much had the benefit of being able to develop our Marac from the ground up. It's not been an ad hoc service, it's a new service. It is working across the whole of Ayrshire, 3 local authority areas, 1 policing authority and 1 NHS board. So it has allowed us to take that kind of holistic Ayrshire approach to ensure best value in terms of how we implement the Marac, and that has allowed us to think about, for instance, our leadership government and governance arrangements. We have very much thought of developing the Marac as an additional parallel public protection stream, similar to child and adult protection MAPA. So with service level agreement, we have our governance structure with strategic oversight group through violence against women up into chief officer groups. We have developed for training and even down to the kind of operationalisation of all the day-to-day stuff like Marac transfers and some other bits and pieces that we've had to do, and also embed them into business continuity. We've taken it down to that stage as well. So we've really had a lot of benefit of learning and taking, and I'm sure a lot of people had the pain that we perhaps haven't had to feel, because we have learnt and had the benefit and support from others who have gone before, and that's been really beneficial to us here locally in Ayrshire. I think the hosting arrangements that Dale mentioned earlier, that universal service, and it was quite, when I heard one of the authentic voices saying, you know, she thought it was police-led and she was frightened to say something because her children get taken away. I think that was one of the kind of key discussions that we had early doors about who and was best placed, because we've learned from others the different mix of how Maracs have developed, who is the Marac coordinator, what that team looks like, whether it be statutory service, local authority, police or third sector, where it is. So these are the things that I think have allowed us to benefit and understand, and one of the things that we meant to the NHS is the universal neutral service, if you like, from a victim survivor perspective as well, that it didn't particularly have that police, you know, focus and feel of it in terms of the badging. So we've also had a very strong concern and understanding, take a kind of trauma-informed approach to some of the work that we're trying to do as well. In terms of the consideration of the agency reps, the vicarious trauma, what they're hearing, and again, maybe I've learnt some of the benefit from others. And so the chair, who's a DI, a detective inspector who takes our chairing responsibilities for the Marac, he will debrief everyone at the end of our Marac meetings, just a bit of self-care to advocate for that, and we've put out resources over and above the kind of organisational responsibilities. The Maracs allowed for a little bit of layer of kind of quality in terms of additional provision of support in terms of wellbeing to those who are embedded and involved weekly with the Marac. So at the moment we're still finding our way. We've come through the initial implementation. It seems to be going well, touch wood up here. We're very much looking at our safety actions, what we're actually doing in terms of adult focused actions, child focused actions, and very much perpetrator focused actions. We have made some additional changes to how we've implemented some of the kind of, for instance, the confidentiality statement. We've just tweaked that very slightly, and we've also taken slightly different approaches in terms of who represents at the meetings. So, for instance, one of our local advocacy services, they wanted to involve a lot more of their advocates in representing the voice of their victim survivor. And initially we thought that that wouldn't work, but I suppose, again, having changed on and perhaps even the pandemic allowing that kind of virtual platform of working and operating now, that actually online, having someone else advocate and speak, it worked actually much better probably in our initial thoughts than it would in terms of delivery. And I'm sure that that probably couldn't have happened in the face-to-face environment that maybe the Marac started off with. So we've managed to take in some different approaches and have a look at what we're going to start to reflect on, what our Marac has achieved in terms of the actions. We're going to look at self-evaluation. It's been mentioned by Jess, it's been mentioned before. It's really important to understand how our Marac's functioning and actually what the experience of the victim survivor is, because that's something that it's been key to some of our local discussions, and actually our advocacy services have taken lead on that, because they're the ones very much with that kind of expertise and are very close to that. So they've agreed and volunteered to take that forward in terms of that kind of improvement work. So very much at a reflection stage now as we move forward, and we're going to look back at how our Marac is operating and where we need to learn and improve. And if we just go on to the next page, please, thank you. And just a bit of some of our data. Very much the graph will explain and hopefully show, as Dale has already articulated, we've already had a number of our Maracs, and this is the cases. And as you can see, we're going up in a kind of an upward trajectory. Initially, our numbers were a bit lower. We didn't have any repeats coming in, but now as we move forward, start to get our repeats again, and that's bringing our numbers up to where our baseline SafeLives numbers should be, and hopefully take us to the kind of estimated kind of numbers of cases that we would see within Ayrshire. So that is probably a whistle-stop tour of where we have come from and where we are now in Ayrshire. And hopefully, as I say, if there's any questions, there'll be an opportunity later on, and that's our contacts for anybody that wants to kind of get in touch with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dale and Mandy. That was really interesting, and it's great to hear from our newest Marac in Scotland as well, alongside some of the more established Maracs. And I think what is brilliant to hear is how you've been able to access some of the learning that's already existed across Scotland and how that's informed your own developments. And it's been really lovely to be able to follow that over the last sort of 2 years and see the model kind of being built and being established across Ayrshire. A reminder again that if you've got any questions, please pop them in the Q&A function, and we'll get to that after all of our guest speaker inputs. I'm gonna try and do a little bit, I suppose, summing up from our guest inputs before we go into that, and just kind of reflect on some of the work that's ongoing across Scotland in terms of where we go next for Marac. And also bring in some of the data that we currently collect from across our 35 now operational Maracs. So if we can go to the next slide, Steph, please. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but we thought it would be just useful to just reflect on the fact that we now have a near full national Marac data set in Scotland. So 32 out of our 35 operational Maracs currently submit data to us on a quarterly basis, and we collate and do some analysis on that. What we've been seeing over the last sort of 3 years is a consistent increase in referrals across those 32 Maracs up until this very last quarter. So this is the very latest Marac data that we've got available up until September this year, which then obviously includes our 3 new Ayrshire Maracs as well. If we remove the Maracs who have been submitting data to us for less than 12 months, so where we don't have comparisons, for the first time in the past, I think, 2 years, so since the start of the pandemic, we've actually seen a decrease in referrals to our Scottish Maracs. But prior to that, what we've been seeing is a consistent increase across Maracs across Scotland. However, this still varies hugely across different areas. And if we go to the next slide, we'll get a sense of kind of just how much that varies. So these are the individual Maracs who send us our data. You'll see the Scotland average there, as well as the purple line on the screen, and the UK average is the grey one, up a bit further, and then our expected level of referrals, which is 40 per 10,000 of the female population, including repeat referrals. And I think what we can see is there is huge variation across Maracs, and I think to an extent that links to things like capacity and resourcing. But it also does mean that we need to think about what the response to victims who are not being able to access their Marac locally, what that looks like. As you can see, most of our Maracs kind of sit between that kind of average and the recommended level, but we also have quite a few Maracs that actually are seeing referral levels well in excess of what we would be expecting, and that will have implications in terms of resourcing and capacity for those Maracs to kind of respond effectively to those referrals and to those victims. If we go to the next slide, please, Steph. What we're also seeing when we're looking at our data and the data picture and what we know about how victims access services and support across Scotland is that 90%, or actually I think almost 91% of our Scottish Marac referrals come from either the police, an IDA service, or another specialist service in the voluntary sector. And that is while at the same time as we know that police may become aware of less than 1 in 5 domestic abuse incidents, and that 2/3 of survivors might not access specialist services. So it leaves a huge gap in terms of who is being seen at Marac and who actually reaches our Maracs in Scotland. And if a victim doesn't pick up the phone, or if they don't approach their local specialist service, will they be able to access that coordinated response to risk? What we also know is that referrals for Black and racially minoritized victims, LGBT victims, and disabled victims are well below what we would be expecting based on what we know about kind of prevalence rates and population data. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see that a bit more clearly as well. So especially in terms of racially minoritized victims, LGBT victims, and victims with a disability, you'll see that the referral levels there are well below what we would be expecting based on local population data or based on what we know in terms of prevalence rates in the population. And in contrast to kind of overall referrals, what we've been seeing as well over the last 2 quarters, whilst other referrals have kind of consistently been going up, what we've been seeing is for these groups of victims, referrals have actually been decreasing. So there's a lot more work that we need to be doing in terms of ensuring that all victims who are potentially at high risk of harm can receive that coordinated response to risk, and that they are able to actually access support from their local Maracs. If we can go to the next slide, please, Steph. Over the last sort of year, through our Safer Sooner programme, we've been working with a number of specialist services across Scotland on understanding what responses to victims who experience so-called honour-based abuse look like across Scotland. And I think that work and the quotes that are on the screen now from focus groups that we ran with specialist practitioners in the spring really highlight the need for us to think about how we increase access to Marac for all victims. I think for all victims, but especially for those who are currently underrepresented at Scottish Maracs, and for those who may be experiencing different types of abuse as well, and where the picture of risk looks slightly different from what we would be traditionally expecting it to look like. So working with specialist services across Scotland has really highlighted some of those practice issues and inconsistencies around those responses, and insecurities, I think, in particular, and concerns about how to best respond to those cases, and making sure that we that we make space around the virtual table for specialist practitioners who work with these groups of victims as well. We've also been working with small and specialist services who support victims who are currently underrepresented at Marac to better understand some of those barriers to access and engagement with Marac, both in terms of referral pathways and for victims themselves, but also for practitioners in small and specialist services in terms of their own engagement with Marac processes and being able to access those structures. And I think all of that and a lot of what we've been hearing from the different speakers today kind of all ties into thinking about where we go next in terms of Marac development in Scotland and what the priorities for that should look like. So if we go to the next slide, please, Steph. I think moving forward, what we've heard from some of the speakers today, or from all of the speakers, and from the inputs from the Authentic Voice Panel members as well, is the need for more consistency across the country, across the different Maracs. We're really pleased to see the work of the Marac Advisory Group now being now moving forward as well. And we really look forward to seeing the recommendations, the practice recommendations in the new year, and working with Scottish Government and other partners and taking that forward. I think what we've all been hearing is kind of national standards and something to support that consistency across areas is really needed. But we need to think about what those standards look like. So I think all of our speakers today have spoken about the need for that balance between operational and strategic oversight and buy-in and embedding the Marac process locally really solidly. Maracs have the biggest impact and are the most effective when they sit alongside other local and national public protection processes, and when they can reflect both local and national policy and be supported by joined up referral pathways and specialist support for victims. And I think that's something that we've heard from all of our speakers this morning. If we can move forward, Steph. So when we're thinking about national standards and kind of national practice guidance or a statutory footing or whatever that might look like in the future, I think we need to make sure that that is built on the current an understanding of the current best practice, informed by both Marac professionals and survivors and our current data, that we keep those survivor voices at the heart of this work, and that we're really keeping sight of the fact that they're the reason why we're here and why we're wanting to improve these systems. And we need, and I saw a comment in the chat earlier as well around it being lovely to kind of hear and see the local kind of differences and different approaches that have been taken, and that can be really useful to kind of recognise that we need slightly different approaches depending on where we are, but that without that kind of national oversight or national structures to support that, it can also contribute to kind of some of the discrepancies that we're maybe perhaps seeing currently. So although we need standards that allow for that local flexibility and that can take into account local differences, there is a strong need for national kind of guidance and practice standards that can support that sustainability going forward. And both local and national Marac development needs to continue to be informed by voices of survivors alongside practitioners and that robust Marac data, making sure that we respond effectively to all victims, including victims from diverse backgrounds, and that we're including the voices of small and specialist services in that work going forward as well. And we've heard as well from the speakers around the need for evaluation and outcomes monitoring, but also thinking about what we do with that data when we have it. So how do we use that to then inform next steps and moving forward in terms of our developments. Those are some of our thoughts that we kind of thought would be helpful to sum up some of the inputs that we've heard today before we go into our next bit of the event, which is our Q&A session with the panelists. So I think we're going to get the slides down for a bit. Again, if you've got any questions for the speakers, then please put them in the Q&A box. We've got a couple there, and we've got a few of our own as well. So we're going to get the guest speakers back on camera, and they'll be able to answer any of your questions. And we've also got Nell Whiting, who is the Violence Against Women and Girls team lead in the Equality Unit at Scottish Government, in case you have any questions for government. And Lucy McDonald, who is the head of our SafeLives Scotland team as well. So we'll get all our speakers back up, and I think we've got a couple of questions. I'm gonna see if my colleague Kirsty will keep me right in terms of the questions that we've got.
Yeah, so I think the first one we have is, how integral to the delivery of a successful Marac do you think having a domestic abuse court is? We don't have a court in Ayrshire. It's from Dale Meller.
Well, I take that. I think that we're in a different situation now than we were in 2005. We've since then, in terms of court processes, we've got CLPFS with a national marking process. We've also got a national aim of 8 to 10 weeks to the first trial for every domestic case in Scotland, whether there's a domestic abuse court or not. I think the issue just now in that particular arena is more around adjournments and the level of time that people are stuck in the system. So for me, looking back now, we're less, that's less important, but what is crucial, I think, is the advocacy. I think the systematic contact with survivors and working with survivors until risk is reduced, that regular review of risk, but also that partnership with survivors, so that we make sure that they're feeding in to a Marac is far more crucial than a domestic abuse court. But I think that's more about time and processes and changes in statutory and local partners.
Thanks, Mhairi. Does anybody else want to come in? Yes.
I think just echoing what Mhairi said there, but also to highlight the fact that all of our court systems should be domestic offence aware and have the same training and ability to handle domestic abuse cases, victims, and so on within their courts, I think is really essential as well. So just to add that.
Thank you. Move on. There's another question here. It says, I still feel there is gaps with mental health and addiction input at Marac. Although the police and IDA updates state that these are risk factors, they are unknown by the agency. Are there any tips to get them to be more proactive in their response? Dale, go ahead.
I suppose I'm just drawing on the benefit of having recently tried to get everyone around the table in Ayrshire, and you know, arrangements locally are different across Scotland. So obviously you need to tap into your local systems, services and governance to, you know, to support people to come around the table. We didn't have many barriers because we kind of went at it from fresh. So we weren't having to make the case to some of our adult service colleagues that, you know, they needed to be there, because we approached it from a perspective of, you're going to be there, you know, you're equally as important as justice or children and families. But I suppose the kind of softer stuff that has helped them has been support, debrief, good training, opportunity to discuss roles, what are safety actions and what is business as usual. We've had quite a big debate around that locally. So you're not coming to a Marac saying, yeah, there's a support worker. If there's already a support worker from a drug service, for example, involved, that's not a safety action. So It's really supporting our colleagues in adult services, to use an umbrella term, to feel confident and relevant at a meeting, and then not to be overwhelmed by taking something back that might be a bit different to normal practice for them. So yeah, I mean, having come from the adult world, I guess I can tune into some of those anxieties. Is that a new referral? What do I do with that? How do I deal with confidentiality if I haven't got the victim survivor's consent? So it's really about breaking down some of these things. And I guess if you still are at the stage of needing a mandate, then you're going to have to review attendance at Marac and take that up through your governance structures to identify some gaps. But practitioner support has been really important locally. I hope that's helpful.
Brilliant, thank you, Dale. Lily, you're next.
Yeah, I've just been thinking about the people that we found it more straightforward to get to the table were colleagues from mental health and addictions. And some of that was because we had Sandra Ferguson was the clinical psychologist for the EVA project, who's now like the architect of the NHS Education for Scotland trauma training framework. And so we'd been doing work on getting people to understand the connection between trauma and addictions for the sort of 4 years that we've been up and running, and getting people to understand that domestic abuse and other forms of gender-based violence were also also had traumatic impact, and that so there was overlap. There was a Venn diagram between the people that they were seeing, the women that they were seeing, and the men that they were seeing, who were carrying trauma histories, who were using substances as a way to manage those histories, and who were in situations either where they were perpetrating violence or they were experiencing violence from a partner. And so we were beginning to have some impact with that. We called it the EVA model as a way to get people to understand that these were not new clients. They weren't different people. They were the people that we were already working with, and that this was a way to expand the understanding. And the bigger issue for us was getting people past that huge barrier of not wanting to share information, because for health workers, that privacy of information and confidentiality is so core to their professional identity that it was really difficult to get them to go, oh, maybe it's relevant for me to share that was the hardest bit, actually, was the information sharing. I think now, different landscape in terms of trauma awareness and trauma-informed practice. Very, very different landscape from 2004. And I wonder if that's one of the roots.
Really positive answer, thank you, Lily. Lucy?
Thanks, Kirsty. Just to add to Dale and Lily's input, my answer isn't specific to mental health or substance use, but sort of two things that really stand out to me as being important to increase participation across Scotland. Won't surprise anyone that I will say national quality standards and a strategic framework for Marac in order to give stakeholders the resources, the support and enable them to participate and be accountable for the Marac process. So I think that is key. But also, as the Minister said up front this morning, we need to be better at identifying and understanding domestic abuse more widely across our stakeholder networks and across our society. And to me, that's going to be key to compelling all different types of stakeholders to actively engage in the Marac process and the whole system response to people experiencing domestic abuse. In a really strengths-based way, so capacity building, enabling people, equipping them to feel confident to respond. I truly believe that is the difference that's going to make all different practitioners and stakeholders get involved and respond sensitively and appropriately and feel accountable to what is happening on the ground within relationships.
Thanks, Lucy. Barry?
I think there's also a hierarchy at play. Because Marac doesn't have a statutory basis, then I think that people and agencies see it as a second-class option. They don't, there's the struggle about the persuading them that it's important. There's the struggle about how do we share information, but then there's the struggle about, well, how can I fit that into my day-to-day work when we're all strapped? And I think that's the same issue that we're coming up against when we don't have as everybody going to Marac, or we don't have as many Marac, whatever it is, whatever the problem is, it all comes back to the fact that we're being seen as a secondary, or not as important, because it's not got a statutory footing. And I remember when we talked about this initially, somebody saying to me, well, putting it in a statutory footing actually doesn't mean very much. But it's the importance that that indicates to local authorities, to health services and to others. We know how important it is because we work with survivors. But it's really important that it has the importance and sits in an appropriate place within the landscape.
Thanks, Mhairi. A lot of agreement in the chat for you there as well. We'll move on to another question we've got. One of the speakers mentioned Safe and Together. Given that Safe and Together is being introduced across most areas of Scotland and that Maracs are now widespread, can anyone say anything about what they think the impact of the implementation of Safe and Together and all the training and change anticipated to systems will have on Marac processes? Mhairi, go ahead.
Going back to Assist's experience, there was a fundamental difference when we introduced Safe and Together as a way of framing our input to Marac about children and young people. And I know it would be unusual, but it might be useful getting Fiona's input points on this, because we spent a whole lot of time ensuring that we adopted the Safe and Together principles and used that as a way to feed into Marac. And we certainly felt at the time that that meant that the perpetrator focus, if you like, was easier and more visible to other agencies.
Thanks, Mhairi. Anybody else want to come in?
I'll just come in briefly and just say that we've been, over the last year, been doing a bit of talking with the Safe and Together Institute about the overlap between the Safe and Together model and Marac, and how we can, I suppose, better bring in some of the principles of the Safe and Together model into our Marac systems, in particular in terms of how we focus on perpetrators and holding them accountable, and recognising domestic abuse as a parenting choice in cases where there are children. So we're hopeful that we'll be able to say more about that and what that might look like in the new year. But yeah, it's been really interesting to have those conversations and to think about where those models overlap and where we can learn from each other and how we can bring in principles of one into the other as well.
Dale, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm really interested, Jenny, in following that up. I think in Ayrshire we've got the 3 areas, but 1 Marac, and Mandy may have a take on this, or it might be far too soon because Mandy is in all of them. We're at different stages with Safe and Together across the 3 sort of local areas. And I see it influencing the culture and the way the meeting is framed, as well as what Mhairi has described, which is bringing the victim information in a way that is perpetrator focused as well. So for me, the differences would be much more about the framing of the responsibility, and then the actions, being weighted more towards the perpetrator and more support towards the victim. But it might be quite difficult to measure that. But I wonder if in Ayrshire, because East has implemented Safe and Together, North is implementing, and South are use signs of safety, there might be some different characteristics there that we could try and evaluate potentially. Anyway, I'm just sort of thinking out loud. But Mandy, I don't know if it's obvious to you the sort of differences between the 3.
No, Dale, because as you said, it's at different stages of implementation, and actually we're sort of going to be meeting with the lead in early January, so it's certainly on our radar to consider that, and I think Marac is certainly the kind of place that we can look at that, reflect on it, and see what we can look at in terms of the kind of actions. And I think that's some of the discussions we've had about that kind of perpetrator focus as well, and how we do that and how we evaluate it. But it's certainly something I think that we are going to be very cognizant of, and we'll take forward that in the new year. As you say, we're just at various stages of implementation for practice as well.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. I think we're going to move on. Is that correct? Looking at Jenny, yes. To a bit more of a group input, which we've got a slide for. As if by magic.
It's almost like we've practiced this. So we wanted to bring in the reflections of those of you in attendance as well, and give you a chance to feed in. And what I'll say is, any questions that we've not got to as part of this Q&A section, we'll put to the speakers afterwards, and we'll circulate responses. If you would all like to go to menti.com or scan the QR code, hopefully that should work, or click on the link in the chat, it should take you straight to it. So depending on your preference and how you want to do it, if you've got a separate tablet or phone, or if you're using a separate browser window. We just wanted to, I guess, sum up and finish up the events by thinking about where we go next for Marac in Scotland, and what the priorities for Marac development in Scotland should be, or what they are in your views. So whilst we give you a chance to kind of think about that, we're going to put that very same question to the panelists as well, and see what your thoughts are on priorities for Marac development going forward. Does any of the speakers want to go first?
I'll jump in. National standards.
Thanks,
Absolutely. Evaluation, appropriate data collection, some kind of national oversight that will pull all the things together, a network so that we can all share best practice. All of the things that's being mentioned, it's just great to be able to have an event like this that looks not just at the history but where we're going next, and it's just fantastic. So yeah, statutory footing please, and national evaluation and standards.
Thank you, Barry.
Yeah.
Lucy.
What Barry said.
Yeah.
But also just highlighting Pervin's points in the chat about having third sector specialist services around the table at Marac. 100% is part of our evaluated model, and I do genuinely think that having those baseline standards will support that as well, because we can work with local areas to ensure that they're looking at local demographics and making sure that the routes into Marac are widened as much as possible.
Thanks, Lucy. I think Lily next.
Yeah, also what Barry said. The biggest regret I have about the way that we set up the Marac in North Lanarkshire was not pushing harder to embed evaluation from the start, because we had no way to know at the time what impact we were having, and it means that there's never been a benchmark for what came next, and I think that it was deeply problematic. The notion of national standards certainly is like, it's news to me because I've not been so involved in the field, but definitely. And I saw Pervin's comment in the chat and was really surprised and quite disappointed to realise that there's still a an absence of third sector involvement, specialist service involvement, because we had some difficulty getting, again, the information sharing thing. Public sector services have systems that talk to each other, and they weren't keen on sharing information outside those systems. But I would think that now, in the information age that we live in, there must be ways to overcome that. So I'd really like to see more of an emphasis on bringing the expertise of the third sector to the table, because it's there and really valuable. So that.
Thanks, Lily. And we'll bring in Nell as well.
Great, thank you very much. I mean, I suppose from a Scottish Government point of view, as the Minister said in her speech, what we're really keen to do and what my priorities are is really to be working with all of the experts in this virtual room to take forward the recommendations. And I think we've heard loud and clear, and we're seeing it again on the Menti today, but from all of the speakers, as well as the consultation, the deep dive reports, and the most recent event that we held. You know, there's the issue of the statutory footing, there's the issue of national standards, the kind of the monitoring and evaluation, the necessity of authentic voice being through that. And I think we've got about 6 really strong recommendations that, you know, we're looking to take forward very much with you and with the experts over the coming months. And I just want to pick up on the point that Lily's just made, picking up on Pervine's point in the chat around the importance of the third sector expertise. And I think, you know, I do think what Lucy said was just right too, that actually if we have got those national standards, it will give a place to everybody around the table. But just doing that kind of loop back to where we started, and as the Minister said in her speech, you know, one of the things that Equally Safe identified back in 2014 was it was where the statutory and third sectors were working together effectively through Maracs, that they were at their strongest and at their best. And I think it's the strongest and best that we want to be taking forward. I'm going to shut up now.
No, thank you, Nell. That's really helpful and really useful to hear as well in terms of next steps. I've been looking at the Menti inputs as they've been coming through, and lots of what Barry said, and lots of comments around both national standards and statutory footing, but also comments around kind of bringing learning together and facilitating that knowledge exchange as well, training and support, and increasing kind of accessibility and representation at Marac for victims who are currently underrepresented, linking in with other public protection systems and structures as well. I'm seeing a comment there around bringing in the voices of children affected by domestic abuse as well, which I think probably links quite well with the conversation we had around Sticking Together earlier as well. I'm going to bring in Jess, and then I'm going to just ask the panelists as well before, in the last couple of minutes before we move on in the agenda, what you think some of the barriers for us achieving some of the things that we've kind of identified as the best practice or the next steps, what they might be. But we'll come to Jess first for your reflections on priorities and or any barriers that you see in making that happen as well.
I just wanted to pick up, as I saw it, the reason my hand went up was because I saw a point come up there about creative action planning and creative tasking. I suppose that's more an operational concern for Maracs, but it's potentially would link into what you're asking for, Jenny, which is a barrier. I think all of the points about developing sustainable Maracs with standards and frameworks and really embedding them and making them firm and funded is all brilliant and should happen, but there is a little bit of a risk that Maracs then become less flexible and less creative and able to change. That's kind of a barrier I can see coming, and I obviously have the benefit of working for a very well established Marac, but the looking forward and making sure that we're still creatively tasking, and we saw that in COVID, and making sure that things fit the victim's needs and the survivor's needs in that family is really essential. And I don't think we can lose sight of that And I'm not suggesting for a minute that national standards would say these are what the tasks are and that's what that is. That's not their remit. But I just think it's worth bearing in mind. And I was pleased to see it come up there, that there should always be that focus on what good tasking looks like at the Maracs, because it is the tasks that that basically form what the victim will get out of Marac. That's what they get in a large part. So that was what I wanted to say there, Jenny.
Thanks so much, Jess. Any other reflections from the guest speakers around the barriers to achieving these priorities or challenges to achieving these priorities currently? Barry.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with what Jess said there about what is good tasking. I think it's really important. It comes back to training, doesn't it, of everyone that's sitting around the table to make sure that people understand what good tasking is, and also picks up on the point made earlier about by Dale, about people coming along and saying, we've allocated a support worker. That's what you would do anyway. And therefore that embedding Marac and Marac processes in a way that can cope with the changes of staff that we all have in all the different organisations. And it all comes back to how Marac is seen locally, the structures, and ultimately the funding. And I think that as we're sitting today in as with many families in states of economic emergency, then that becomes ever more difficult. And I think we will need to be creative going forward to keep pushing for what we want to achieve, but also recognising the real problems that everyone's facing.
Thanks, Barry. And Dale, next.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think if and when we move into standards and kind of national frameworks around this, which I think everyone is agreeing would be helpful, we don't want to kill local creativity, workarounds, and all of the good partnership working. So we kind of need to be really careful in implementing anything from a national perspective, that it works, that it's lightweight in terms of reporting and flexible, but we get the benefits of evaluation and learning, because what's been so good about today is like a sponge really hearing about just a few local examples of how people are doing this, or how people have been doing it. And we all know that if the burden of reporting becomes too great, then the same people, like, you know, who are here today, who are responsible for learning and development and all of the spin-offs that come from good implementation of Marac, might be stymied by reporting requirements. So we need to find the balance, would be my observation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dale. That's helpful. We're going to move on, just looking at the time as well. But thank you to all the guest speakers for your time today and for taking the time to answer some of the questions as well. We're going to move on to closing remarks, and I'm going to bring on Suzanne Jacob, who is the CEO of SafeLives, to just close us out for this event.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Oh my gosh, this has been such a good morning. So a couple of things, I guess, from me. To start, you know, what Mhairi and Lily had to say, I thought just set the most amazing context for the roots of this work, including that powerhouse team originally in South Wales, who were showing all of us as practitioners around the UK how things could be radically different. It's also clear the huge amount of work it's taken to get from that point to here for all of you who've been pioneers of Marac work in Scotland. And I think there's still a lot of pioneering going on from the contributions we've had over the last couple of hours. There was a really momentous moment in 2014, others have alluded to it. 8 years ago, Marac was included in Equally Safe, Scott, this such an important fundamental part of what's going on. SafeLives were funded at that point to create a Marac Development Programme, which built on the vision that the team had to create the 3 essential pillars of a risk-led approach for Scotland: identification, specialist advocacy, robust multi-agency intervention, and followed that creation 10 years ago now of accreditation for IDAs as specialist workers. Upholding that standard is a really important part of what we collectively do, and is a partnership that carries on to this day with Assist and Scottish Women's Aid. Progress, as people have said, with Marac was slow, and it's not always linear. Sometimes there are steps back as well as steps forward, but that's not for lack of enthusiasm and commitment from so many professionals on the ground. I never believe in working tirelessly, but I do believe in working relentlessly. All of us get tired and we've got to accept it. But people haven't given up, they've kept going. And that, the real incentive for that continues to be making victims safer in every way that we all can. The localised commitment was evidence from the Scottish Government consultation and subsequent deep dives with stakeholders. The pandemic has then, very recently over the last couple of years, cemented the critical value of Maracs in taking decisive joined-up action at a time when so many other systems or parts of the system ground to a halt, which again just really reflects that commitment people are showing. So hopefully now the re-establishment of the Marac Advisory Group will lead to a mirroring of this commitment from Scottish Government in the form of an action plan, all of the things that people have just been calling for on the Menti, that consistent, robust framework across Scotland once and for all. We know Marac, of course, is just one approach, but as we've heard today, it is a really important one within a whole system of response that puts women as victims on the path to long-term safety. And I just come back to Helen's comment that it saved my life, and also the Minister's comment that we can only do this work by working together, and that is absolutely at the core of Marac. She did also say you're all amazing, which is quite nice and is worth repeating. The challenges remain huge, but the determination of people on this call and supporting this work all across Scotland, I think, are more than a match for those challenges. Helen didn't give up, so none of us can either. The Marac Action Plan work ties in really well, obviously, with the Domestic Homicide Review Task Force, which meets for the very first time tomorrow morning. And we're really pleased at SafeLives to be part of that alongside partners. And like many, we're very much looking forward to seeing the outcomes of the strategic review of funding and commissioning for VOG services in June next year, an opportunity for innovation in Scotland's whole system response to domestic abuse, and looking forward to thinking about how that picture includes direct responses to perpetrators of abuse inside and outside the criminal justice system that moves us forward alongside that critical support needed for adult and child victims. So lots has changed since 2014, legislation, systems, organisations. Internally, the SafeLives team has grown. We have that authentic voice strategy to embed lived experience all the way through our work, and we're so proud of that. And we're working with a growing range of specialist partners who are committed to widening those routes into Marac, which people were just picking up on, and all forms of support for everyone experiencing domestic abuse in Scotland. As people have touched on, Marac has to be available to anybody who needs it, whatever your characteristics and background, whatever your specific situation. And Jenny picked up some of the disparities in the current data, in particular, a really eye-watering gap between the number of people with a disability we'd expect to see within Marac caseload and the very low number we're actually seeing coming through at the moment. And this is despite additional vulnerabilities that the co-occurrence of domestic abuse and disability can create. So the gap in numbers, we know, can be a low rate of identifying certain victims. It can also be a low rate of adequately asking about and recording disability and other characteristics when practitioners are not confident to have those conversations with service users. And it can be a mixture of both of those things. We have got what we call spotlight reporting on this and other specific groups on the SafeLives website, though unfortunately, because of when we wrote them and what data we didn't have access to at the time, they are very much based on England and Wales data, but hopefully they might still offer some useful input to people if you'd like to check those out. So we've got a lot more to do, but together we're in a stronger position than ever to make victims and survivors safer sooner. And just to finally repeat, if Helen didn't give up, neither will we. So thank you so, so much for joining us this morning. Thank you for everything that you're all doing, for your persistence, for your determination, for your absolute doggedness in carrying on. So much fantastic work still to come. And we know we're going to end domestic abuse for everyone and for good.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, and thanks to everyone who has joined us this morning. Thanks for all the wonderful comments in the chat. It's been really great to follow along and to see your reflections. And thanks for coming along this morning and taking time out. Please stay in touch. If you've got questions or follow-ups after the event, our contact details are there. Please continue to reflect on Twitter and tag us in your thoughts on about the event. I think Hannah's dropped a wee evaluation in the chat as well. If you've got 2 minutes to give us your thoughts on what worked well, we'd really appreciate that. And just to flag as well that we'll be on hand after the event if there's anyone who feels like they need a little bit of extra support, because what we've been speaking about this morning has brought things up for you. So I think my colleagues Kirsty and Jen are going to drop their email addresses in the chat as well. In case anybody wants to follow up on anything afterwards, or feel like they want to just have a chat or a debrief, Jen and Kirsty are on hand to do that. Or you can reach out to us through scotland@safelives.org.uk for any follow-up questions or anything that today is raised for you. We're really looking forward to working alongside all of you and the Scottish Government in the new year to take forward the recommendations from the Marac Advisory Group and the deep dives last year and the learning report from that. And thanks again for joining us this morning. It's been brilliant to hear from all the guest speakers. So a big thank you to all of you for your contributions, and thanks to everyone for joining us. And that's it. I'll give you 5 minutes back of your day.